Well, thanks. Is everything working happily now? I'm going to assume so. You tell me. Okay, great. So I don't think there's the only two options. It's not just that regulation could enable something responsible. It's also that it could be the means by which we enable something that really works. So I loved, I think Azim really set me up. That was a fantastic opener. And I think he set up very well this idea of what we can use regulation for. But let's talk about some other things. It can also definitely cause problems. I'm going to start out with just a very quick introduction to artificial intelligence. I think everyone here has some idea of what they're talking about. But I like to really say that there's been some complaints about this with the new AI regulation. So those of you who are not keeping up with the European Union has put out its draft legislation on artificial intelligence and digital service more generally as several separate pieces. And the AI regulation has been criticized for being too general. I would say not general enough. Let's just think about software. But anyway, let's talk about intelligence in a very general way. Why? Because it gets to that point that Azim was just making about professionalism and inspection. So intelligence is just the capacity to do the right thing at the right time. That was how it was defined in like 1870 when people were first trying to say, well, which animals are more intelligent than each other? This is not some weird hacky explanation, but I love it because it's a clean one. It shows you that we're talking about computation. You're transforming perception and context information into action. All right. So the next piece, then, if you can accept that, if you know what intelligence is, artificial intelligence is easy. It's just a subset of all the intelligent things that someone has built deliberately, all right? It's something that allows us to facilitate our intentions through exploiting and deploying that computation. Explicit and deliberate, they're parts of human intelligence. They're not all of human intelligence. We have a lot of implicit parts. We have a lot of things that we can't control. Our implicit biases, our blushing, things like that. But the parts we discuss are the explicit and deliberate parts. And those are the ones that we hold accountable for things like AI. Okay, so now let's talk about regulation. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I actually do work in things in biology quite often, in things like gene regulatory networks. So I'm going to, again, give you a very broad definition of regulation, and then we'll zone in. We're going to have data about AI soon. I promise it's going to be data slides. That's why I've got the computer here. Regulation is the means by which a complex entity perpetuates a recognizable version of itself. So it's not that you get to live forever, it's that there's a lineage, a biological lineage that our species is able, through the individual regulation, to create. And also we have social regulation for our species, and for quite a lot of other species, we have social regulation as well as individual regulation, okay? So the governance is a subset of regulation. It's a subset that we do deliberately and explicitly. So we only talk about governance in humans, not in other species, right? Let's get to, yeah, there we go. So government is a subset of all the kinds of governance we do. It's a special entity that we set up to coordinate for a geographic region. We're coordinating our governance. And so it possesses, in theory, since about, I forget, 1600s, monopoly of force, right? So this is the only thing that's allowed to declare war. And if something else starts behaving in a warlike manner, killing with, police are not allowed to kill unless their lives are in danger. So otherwise it's war, right? So war is only allowed to be executed by governments, and governments team together to make sure that happens, more or less, right? So since the last 70 years, the other thing governments have to do is defend human rights. Almost every government on the planet has signed up to the UN Human Rights Declaration 70 years ago. So we have obligations, for example, to provide healthcare for every human within our borders. It doesn't matter if they're a citizen or what. All right, so governments are useful for certain kinds of coordination. The next thing that we want to talk about is what is it doing when it's regulating technology? Now, a lot of people seem to forget, or they call it something else, that the vast majority of regulation that tech companies are subject to is actually up-regulation. They're given huge amounts of money, they're given tax breaks, they're given special access to building sites. Everyone wants a tech scene. Everybody, we just heard about this. Yeah, Northern Ireland wants a huge tech scene. They want to have winners, right? And they will spend a lot of money doing that. It's relatively little as restrictions, right? I could call that downregulation, but restrictions aren't necessarily a bad thing either, okay? The reason that we have these restrictions is because we use them to benefit innovation through things like stability and sustainability, okay? So it turns out to work better, you tend to get more done in a region with a good government than in a failed state. There's not that many useful things you can do in failed states, whereas these big things come in better places. We'll talk about how good big is later. That's one thing I disagree with Azim's talk there. But anyway, that's coming up. So friend or foe of innovation. This is like a really interesting piece of work that was done actually by a Hertie School PhD student who's now a professor. So this is a graph that what's going on in the y-axis, the vertical axis there is how effective is the government is judged by the World Bank, okay? And what's going on the x-axis is that's the log of the population size. So what you're seeing is that governments tend to be very effective when they get to be about 66 million people, somewhere between 66 and 400 million people, countries can be quite powerful. It's about the right scale for bureaucracy. Smaller than that, and there's a question about what happens when it's too big. If it can get too big, or if there's just too few data points, there may be a ceiling effect on the data here. But look at how much more effective democracies are than autocracies. The global sample includes democracies, okay? So it would be even worse if you didn't have the democracies there propping that up, okay? So democracy, yes, there's a lot of regulation, but it enables an incredibly interesting, rich, and complex way of getting things done. The regulation helps, okay? Let's see, whoops. Okay, this is the slide I was promising before. This is with a colleague, Helena Malikova, this paper actually just came out on Wednesday. I haven't really been promoting it yet because it's been a busy week. But with Helena Malikova, we were annoyed by people that were showing like, oh, there's all these big companies in America, there's all these big companies in China. The EU has no technology. Absolutely false, right? It's just that we don't have really large market capitalization companies because that's not the way we like to run our economy. So there's a big question about what happens when you allow too much power in a very small number of companies. And America actually in the late 19th century decided that we needed to address this question. You know, the idea of democracy was new. It had only been running for about a century, and it just had a catastrophic civil war. I mean, unbelievable numbers of people have died, you know, relative to the population of the country. So then they started noticing very powerful people, and unlike, you know, an autocracy, America at that stage couldn't easily just get rid of too powerful of people. So what they did instead was they invented antitrust. They said, let's try to keep corporations at a scale where they can be governed, right? Now, these things have changed over time. We all know that the Microsoft decision sort of changed midway through with an election. But let's have a look at what's really going on in the world. Is it true that there's no innovation happening in Europe? Well, there's actually, we know that the US has about 24% of the GDP, and the EU has about 22%, and China is somewhere around 19-20%. And then there's the rest of the world. Okay, so there's 4 regions we're thinking about here. And what this graph is showing you is that, again, the bottom, the x-axis, is how large is the market capitalization of a bunch of companies. And the y-axis is showing how much IP have they registered in the world IP index, that WIPO index, under one of the possible categories for AI. So this is not necessarily all the patents, but it's a good subsample. It's a perfectly good representation of what the capacities of these companies. Now, what you see is that, first of all, that IP is a choice, right? Whether you go and you use patents, it's not that Apple doesn't innovate, it's that Apple doesn't feel that it needs the courts, or it doesn't feel that it's worth using the courts compared to just trying to maintain secrecy. Whereas Google and IBM are actually up there fighting for programmers. And so one of the things that they do is they motivate that through the patent system. So patents are used for a number of different things. And I would argue similarly, market capitalization. All of us who know people who are in .coms or whatever, we know that it's a decision, strategic decision, whether you decide to go public and how much effort you expend on trying to do things that will get your shares to go up, right? Versus like how much you want to retain your autonomy. Look at what China is doing. I don't know. It could be a coincidence, but it seems really unlikely to me that Alibaba and Tencent just happen to have the same market cap on the same number of IPs. I think it's quite likely that China is very, very worried about how much power do we want to give to these companies, but at the same time, they've decided to play the market cap game. They've got nervous about what America is doing. That's my guess. And similarly, look at Saudi Arabia has just decided to nationalize its oil, to denationalize, to go public with its oil company, and they're trying to move into AI. So they have a couple of patents too. But so that's the gray is America, the pink is China, the blue is the European Economic Area, everybody covered by GDPR, and the yellow is the rest of the world. Notice that a lot of European big dots on here are in one little country, Switzerland. And what does that tell you about market capitalization and regulation? Okay, in case you weren't able to add that all up with your eyeballs, here's the actual things summed up. And sort of as Azim was just saying, notice that the EU and the China aren't so different for market cap, and they're really not different much for IP as registered in patents. The rest of the world cannot be neglected. Yes, this does include the UK, but actually the UK does not have a lot of these bubbles here. You've seen where it's Japan, it's Korea, as well as Switzerland that are doing a lot of the market cap things, but also there's all kinds of innovation happening in other countries. And then also, look, America has more than all the other ones combined, all right? So the other ones, the fourth region has more than China and the EA combined, and the America has more than the other three regions combined. So when people say that, oh my goodness, Europe has to back America, I feel like, this is America having too big of companies with too much power saying, please don't regulate us, we don't want to change. So I very worry about that narrative. So yeah, it's nothing wrong with being the best at something. Someone has to be best. That's not a crime. But once you get too big, then you have special obligations to prove that you aren't abusing your market dominance. If you're a small company, you can be sneaky, right? But with great power comes great responsibility. There's different obligations for large companies because they can have so much impact on society, including the rest of the market. And so the question is really, what is too big? And as I said, historically, it was because of being governed. And you don't have to go to Tim Wu for that, although he's very readable. You can also go to Mata, go to Harvard. I'm sorry, go up the street if you're at MIT. You can find fantastic, very well-respected accounts of this narrative. All right. So more recently, that got softened to economic inefficiency. Something came out of Chicago, like me. And then now it's price insensitivity. This makes no sense, especially in sectors that allegedly have free products, right? I think it's very important that even if we backed up to thinking about economic inefficiency, we could look at what's happening with wages, both the gross distortions of the undertaxed areas that are disrupting our cities and disrupting our power structures, but also this ridiculous flattening of wages that's happening where there's too much market dominance. Consumers that are employees don't have enough power. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. How am I doing for time? I was going to explain this to you. I'll go ahead and explain this to you. So now we're talking about the y-axis here is price. The x-axis is the quantity that you sell. And if you remember Adam Smith, the diagonal coming from the 0 to the O to the O prime, that's demand. Demand will increase, more will be sold, the cheaper you make your product. And there's two prices listed here. The price that's actually the cost. So if you're a totally efficient company, perfect, thank you. If you have a totally efficient company, then that's how much the price would be. And if you have a monopoly, then you have PM there, also up the Y bar there. Okay. So if you have a fair price, and don't forget, this isn't saying that, the company is being totally ripped off. In theory, they don't have a surplus, but they could still be paying themselves, $1 million a year or something, right? So the fair price, what you're thinking about, the fair price welfare, all welfare is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, okay? And if it's fair price, you get this whole big triangle there, okay? The green triangle. But if it's monopoly price, then we have the benefits for the company have just come up. We've got the surplus, that pink square there. You still get a few consumers. Now notice fewer people get access to the product. A bunch of people no longer are able to afford or consider it worthwhile to buy that product. So you've got fewer of the products sold, and you've lost this whole shaded in region that there's no benefit. So benefit has disappeared because of the excesses going to the companies. Now people say, but we need that surplus to create R&D. And this, again, there's a million versions of this graph too, as you can imagine. But that's the basic idea. It's not efficient to allow markets to set like any random price. So that's why we don't want to have totally monopolistic markets. Okay, so in the past, again, going back to the late 19th century and all those changes that happened there, which I'm not sure if I would agree with, again, I love Azim's talk, but I'm not totally sure that we can say there wasn't exponentials happening, because one of the exponentials was the plugging in, the networking, the way this stuff spread. But then there's a sustainability. Eventually you get everybody connected, right? Anyway, there was this huge impact, and we only have data going for about 1913, because guess what? This is American data, A, and B, we have inequality data from when we decided to ban alcohol sales. And so then we had to replace the tax on alcohol with income tax. So now we know, and that's what the blue here is the share of wealth that the top 1% got. And the red is the how polarized Congress was. So this has been done in every state. It's not just like a national aggregate thing. But this is very American data, but I'm actually working here now in Berlin at the Hertie School of Governance. We're showing similar effects globally. It's a project we're doing this summer. Anyway, the point is that after a single, we had very high polarization. First of all, the prices, the point is that when you have high inequality, you tend to have high political polarization. You tend to have entropy, wars, things like that. And so what happened in the early 20th century was World War I. Then there was a crash, a market crash. And then in the United States, there was enough of the elite that realized this is bad. We'd rather give up some, not all, of our relative advantage than to continue having this. So enough of them started working with the Democrats that you had the New Deal. And so you get the first decline in polarization, because there's like suddenly just a lot of people in the Democratic Party. And then also you get the subsequent increase in redistribution, so the decline in inequality. And that's kept stable. There are people that go around and do their TED Talks about what happened in 1978, this great decoupling. No, there was a great coupling from about 1935 until about 1978. And then we lost some kind of political will, is my opinion. I actually think we knew that the Soviet economy had actually plateaued in the early 70s, and we no longer thought communism was a threat. And so we thought redistribution wasn't worth paying for. Anyway, since then we've had the spiraling increase in inequality and in polarization, and we've seen the disruption that's come from that. So inadequate governance can lead to all kinds of regulatory capture and inequality, and you have these spirals where they feed in on each other. Inequality leads to social unrest, loss of social mobility, so you don't have access to all the good workers. Social mobility is directly correlated with social mobility is less when there's higher inequality and general insecurity. This is also about sustainability. If something isn't sustainable, it can't keep going. And even if you're thinking about like, how do we, what shareholder value doesn't happen in an instant. It happens over years. And if you aren't going to last for years, then you have a problem. So political polarization is correlated with inequality and may be caused by it. And we had a paper came out in December. I won't try to explain that now. I do want to talk briefly about the European Union. We've demonstrated with the GDPR that small countries can work together and regulate external companies, right? It's not that we can tell them what they do in their own house. We just say, when you're in our house, you have to behave this way, or we're not going to let you transact business. And once we did that, the point of the GDPR was not just a set of restrictions. It was also to make all the countries in the EU happy that okay, this is safe, this is okay. And then to make it easier so that there's a single set of legislation. So you could, at that time, do business with 28 companies. I mean, I was doing a lot of discussions with, I didn't get paid by them. I did a lot of stuff with Google for a couple of years before the whole ATAC thing. And they were saying to me, you know, we're going to pull out of Europe on that day, you know, in May, whatever it was. And then, of course, they weren't going to. No one was going to turn their back on that large of a market. But then 6 months later, they were saying, wow, this is great. It's a single API to 28 28 countries. Yes, that's the point. The EU is a trade bloc. It makes business better. And yes, definitely some companies, mistakes were made. Some companies had problems. There was problems with smaller scaling things. But by and large, there's been an explosion in the digital economy, both from people investing from China, from America, and within the EU. I know that the digital economy has become the main economic post of both Austria and Greece, which both had like sort of weird economies before that. And I don't even know how many other countries there are. For whatever reason, people aren't reporting those kinds of values. And I've been talking to the OECD about it. They don't have a good grip on exactly the amount of things going in small, medium enterprises. So yeah, it may be that something like that, coalitions of countries working together, can do even better than host countries because they're less compromised. Although we'll see how the next elections are going in the EU. But so far we've been less compromised, and we don't have to worry about flight because obviously the companies, they have no place to flee. They're choosing to transact this business with us. So yeah, I already said this. Mostly there was benefit to everyone, both in the EU and outside of the EU, because it made it easier to do digital business in the EU after we had the GDPR. With some mistakes were made, they're getting fixed. Okay, so when we regulate AI, we don't regulate the micro details. People think, oh, AI, it's opaque, you can't regulate it. No, you don't regulate the machines, you regulate how the machines are built, okay? So we have to look at things, and this is standard systems engineering. As Aziz was talking about, we need to be able to come in and just inspect the basic human processes, just like we would with a bank. We don't say, show us what the brain cells are doing in the bankers. We say, show us the books. And here are the books if you're developing software. You design and architect the system. You decide where the data comes from. What is it going to do? What are the inputs? What are the outputs, right? And then you go and you make sure that it's secure, and you should be able to document that it's secure. The whole problem with the SolarWinds was like 3 steps up the supply chain of the software libraries, right? So you need to keep track of, and there needs to be increased professionalism here also about the provenance of your software and data libraries. You keep track of who wrote what code to what specification. How did you know it was ready for release? You keep track of the tests. You write to test, and you keep track of this. If you're in the software engineering, then you're going, oh yeah, that we do that. Why doesn't AI do that? If you guys aren't in software, I'm sorry that I left so little time for this part. Anyway, so yeah, and you log the testing itself, not only before release, but also during release, especially if you leave on the machine learning, although hardly anyone does that actually. The people talk about it to try to scare off regulators, but honestly, nobody leaves machine learning on while it's a live system. Yeah, if we were in an audience, I could ask you, do you know, this is actually from Tech Review. Do you know what this map is? If somebody's GDP is going up and someone's going down. Why? Global warming, right? When we're talking about binary narratives, but oh my gosh, we have to beat China or whatever, there's some things that we're all in the same place with, or most of us are on. It's important not to allow people to dismantle our infrastructure. And I'm not even sure that it's the countries here. It may have been in some people that in powerful companies who didn't think it was a good idea to get regulated, and we're still afraid of the GDPR. So can we trust the government? No, of course not. You don't trust governments, and you don't trust companies. You have to make sure they work. You inspect them, you audit them, you maintain vigilance. Governments are a principal means by which we ensure that everyone does what's fair, just, and sustainable. That's how we do that. And sustainability allows us to explore, deploy, and benefit from innovation. So thank you for your time.